Hello and welcome to this InfoSecurity magazine webinar. My name is Danny Bradbury and I'll be moderating this webinar, which is sponsored by Isolate. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to be discussing distributed work and how to secure it. Before I introduce you to today's panelists, there are just a few quick housekeeping points from me. We'll be running some polls throughout the session, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. I'll leave the questions open to give you plenty of time. Also, we're eager to hear your questions for our speakers, so please do use the submit a question option to send them to us. Let us know if a question is for a particular presenter, and we'll do our best to answer them at some point during the session. Lastly, for those of you on Twitter, our hashtag is InfoSecWebinar, so please feel free to join the discussion on social media too. Just going to knock it back to slides here. Okay. A quick note on CPE instructions. This webcast qualifies listeners for 1 CPE credit based on a minimum attendance time of 50, that's 50 minutes. Once you've done that, you can download your certificate from your InfoSecurity account and submit it, and further instructions can be found on the event platform. Please note certificates take 48 hours to be processed and made available to download the following day. So, first things first, let's introduce our speakers. I'm a writer for InfoSecurity. We have Ranulph Green, Senior Manager at Accenture Advanced, Robert Clyde, Board Director at Osaka, and Tal Zamir, Founder and CTO and Board Member of our sponsor today, Isolate. So guys, I'm actually going to get you, as part of our new format here, to introduce yourselves for a couple of minutes. So just let me pull you up on screen. There we go. Maybe we'll start with we'll go clockwise. We'll start with Ranulph. So give us 2 minutes about yourself, Ranulph, for those who haven't met you before.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Yeah, so I work for Accenture, previously Context Information Security, based in New York. The Accenture Arrow, so I think that was kind of like the first part of the acronym. But essentially, it's a pen test and simulated attack team. Pretty large, very diverse range of skill sets. We do pretty much anything in terms of like misuse cases and trying to attack systems, whether it be endpoint security, whether it be a whole organization or a specific application. Most of the cloud services and other every day-to-day applications that everyone uses. At some point, we've probably tested it and made sure that if there are vulnerabilities, at least that the software maker is aware of them. So that's me.
Do you get your hands dirty doing the actual testing, sort of going in and tinkering, or are you more at the managerial level?
I do. I've been a career kind of pen tester, it's kind of getting on for 12, 13 years now. So I've gone through, the whole process of, junior tester, team lead and everything. And I still actually do testing. Recently, I've been doing a lot of like teleconferencing systems. I think one of the things that's coming up is, organizations are actually, delivering expensive teleconferencing systems to their like high value kind of personnel. And they want to make sure that they are as secure as possible. Even if they're off-the-shelf systems, they still want to get a pen test out of them.
So no Zoom bombs.
The kind of thing.
Yeah, but you don't do the physical stuff. It's just the kind of tinkering around with the digital services.
Well, we do like physical security, like full teardown reviews of various different devices, whether it be kind of a multifunction printer or a smart lock or any other smart device. But generally, the team that we have in New York is, I draw the line at if it involves getting out a soldering iron, then we probably wouldn't do that in New York. But anything else is definitely our kind of area.
I was thinking more about the physical intrusions. Where you go
yes, yeah, we do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you done that?
Less common. I have done one. Yeah, it's not really my area. You have to be a certain type of person to really, love doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the one I did, it was interesting. It was like a high-rise, office block in Manhattan, and we were able to, just walk straight in and bypass the front desk. They didn't really do anything about the fact that we didn't swipe, our security cards, and in this case, it didn't have turnstiles.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were able to clone RFID cards and get into all the other areas and find all kinds of credentials lying around on people's desks. So it's interesting because obviously, there are risks of people working at home, but the office is definitely no fortress.
No, that's right. It'd be way more nerve-wracking than doing a webinar, I think. So you do need to be a certain kind of person to to bluff your way into a building. But yeah, anyway, good to meet you, Alan. Thanks for telling us a bit about yourself. Rob, what about yourself? Give us a couple of minutes on your background.
Sure. So I've been doing cybersecurity since before we called it cybersecurity. So way back before the internet, when we called it computer security. So I've kind of seen the evolution of our profession almost from day one, which has been a really interesting ride. I'm currently on the board of directors for ISACA, which is the largest professional association for cybersecurity, IT audit, and risk professionals, with about 150,000 members, 227 chapters worldwide. So robust association, quite well known by professionals, many certifications that are there. Also serve as executive chair for White Cloud Security, which does something called trusted app listing, primarily for endpoints, although it can be used elsewhere. And I'm an executive advisor to a company called Shard Secure, which does micro-sharding as a way to provide data privacy, particularly in the cloud. As I said, I've had a long career. I've been an entrepreneur, started my own company. I've been CTO of Symantec, which back in its heyday, when Symantec was a powerhouse, I was the CTO there.
Wow, long and varied history. Okay, well, no, good to meet you, Rob. Thanks for.
I guess I could say one of my claims to fame is early in my career, before the internet, one of our systems was hacked by Kevin Mitnick.
It's funny when you said you've been in security since before it was internet security. I thought of him. I was going to make a joke about that, and sure enough.
And yeah, I mean, we had a piece of intrusion detection software that I had developed, and Kevin thought it would be a good idea to steal the source code. What he didn't realize is we might actually be running the software, and so we actually, unusually in those days, saw the break-in, saw it happen. We didn't have the kind of tracing equipment, even with the FBI, to trace it back to him. But later, he and Lenny DeSico, the guy who did it, admitted that they were the ones who had actually broken into the system, gave a few details about how they did it that only the perpetrators would know. And Kevin and I have talked many times over the years since then. But anyway, interesting. I was one of the early victims.
I was going to ask you if you've ever met him. So what's it like meeting the guy that owned your system for a while?
It is interesting because in this now it's far enough removed. It probably wouldn't have been so good closer to the time. And I met him a few years afterwards when he got out of jail. We actually did a webinar together, he and I and several other people, much like this. Yeah. It was more of a conference call. We didn't have the video, but we were on a conference call that you could call into and listen to us. But just recently, he and I sat on the same stage at an ISACA event in Vancouver, and we each told our side of the equation of what was happening, which was very interesting. And this far in the past, it was kind of dispassionate, but you could see us both kind of going back and forth of, oh, that's Edgar. I didn't know you were thinking that. And he was kind of like, well, I didn't know you were thinking that. And we're doing that. So, for example, he was surprised to know we had called the FBI and we were watching all the moves. That was kind of news to him. It wasn't so much news to me how he got in, which was social engineering and tricking one of our support people into changing a password for a sysadmin to one that he would know. So he did a lot of research on a particular individual, acted like that individual, and got that to occur.
Again, it's the same kind of thing. It takes a certain kind of person, right? If I try to socially engineer someone, I'd totally fall flat. You've got to have that charisma and that personality.
Exactly, just to pull it off. And he's very good at that. That was something he did many times, not just us.
Well, he wrote the book, didn't he? The Art of Deception. That was a great book.
Exactly. He did. We have a lot of more controls we put in place. Little things like you don't just set the password on the phone to something the user will know. You set the password reset link to their email, and you don't let them tell you the email to send it to. So we've got all kinds of ways that we've learned. We have learned some things over the years.
Yeah, they move one way, you move another way, sort of keep track with them. Yeah, toe to toe. Okay, great. Well, thanks for that, Rob. Interesting story. And Tal, over to you. Great to have you on the webinar. Tell us a bit about yourself and Isolate.
Sure, thanks, Danny. So I've been around just 20 years in the industry of cybersecurity. Started my career early 2000 in the Israeli Ministry of Defense, doing a lot of cyber offense, just like some of us here. Mission critical cyber project that I can't really talk about in depth, but super interesting time. I also then joined a startup called Wanova, which is a virtualization company that was eventually acquired by VMware. So this has been a great journey for me to see how, especially today with remote desktop and virtual desktops, which are super relevant for COVID, how to build an end user computing product for users, allowing them to use VDI and DAS and those types of products. This has been a great journey for me. I spent a few years in the VMware CDO office, innovating in this area for many years. And in the last 5 years, I've been building Isolate, which is kind of a combination of my past experience, both cybersecurity and virtualization. Just a few words about Isolate. What we practically do is split the endpoint into 2 zones locally on the device itself. One is, for example, your sensitive corporate world, while the other is a risky, personal, third-party zone. And there are, with a boundary of a virtual machine between those 2 zones. So it really sets a different barrier for attackers, and super relevant, again, for this era of distributed work, when people are mixing personal and corporate and sensitive and risky activities on the same device. So that's what Isolate does. So quite a journey for us, in this post-COVID era. Just to add a few more, a bit more credibility and context. So I'm part of a group of companies called Team 8. I don't know if you have heard of this, but it's kind of a top Israeli cybersecurity foundry built by the ex-commander of the Israeli NSA, 8200. And we kind of have great visibility into the top pain points of enterprises out there, talking to hundreds of CISOs, CIOs around their cybersecurity pains, and definitely the remote work pain points. So that was super interesting in the last year to see how we can provide a good solution for those companies. That's pretty much, I think, sums it up. Any extra info I can provide?
I'm interested in the in your time in the, I guess, the IDF then, right? The Israeli military. So did you learn most of your cybersecurity and technology chops during that time?
Right. So obviously, I've been around even before that. Hacking computers since I was 6-year-old. So that was my fun and still is. And that's of course the IDF and the tech units in the IDF around cyber really are a great school to get a feel for how it looks like in the real world and getting that attacker's perspective. So that's part I brought in from my own background, and a lot of it I've learned on the job during my IDF service.
So kind of like, well, I guess like both of the other speakers, you've had to kind of think like a hacker or talk to a hacker that's thought like an attacker as well. You've had to experience both mindsets, right? Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, go ahead, yeah.
No, yeah, exciting times, both when I started and was in that side of the table, but also today, you still see the same problems, right, that we had like in the early 2000s, with endpoints still being a problem and still an unsolved pain, and something that that's my passion personally to fix that problem in a more inherent way.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for you about the Isolate tech, but we'll get to that. I think during the panel. Yeah, I wanted to know a bit more about that too. So, okay, but before we get into that, we're gonna just pop back to slides. We have the first of those poll questions I mentioned for the audience coming up here. So I'm just gonna bring up my my poll toolkit here. Okay, good. So yeah, this is the question that I want you guys to answer from the audience. How smoothly did your transition to remote working go when the pandemic struck? So we've got 5 different answers here. Let's very quickly go through them very smoothly because you've been doing it already, so it wasn't much of a transition. You had to sort of to start from scratch, but you did it well. Maybe you had your planning in place already. There were some speed bumps, but you made it. Badly for some reason. Love to hear more about that in the audience questions if that was an issue for you, or you don't have a distributed workforce. Maybe for some reason you didn't need one, due to the type of organization you are, or you just never made it work. So yeah, that poll is open. Please do vote now, the audience. And in the meantime, I'm just going to see if I can get rid of this poll scene here to give me some more room. There we go. So okay, and I'm going to pop back to the presenter. So while the audience votes on that, audience, you've got maybe 10, 15 minutes or so to vote on that poll. I am just going to bring the presenter up here. All right, here we are, all of us again. So yeah, maybe we'll start then, just with a gentle one, talking about the nature of distributed work before we get into the technology side. So companies were doing this already, for years beforehand, but of course the pandemic introduced more pressure and made things more urgent. So maybe I'll start with Ranulph. Just go clockwise here. Could you talk about the nature of distributed work and how it's changed, not just during the pandemic, but maybe over the past 5 years or so, with the pandemic as a sort of punctuation point there?
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point that this was all kind of there beforehand. A lot of the risks are unchanged. It's just the number of people, the amount of attack surface is vastly increased. So the company I work for, Accenture, is absolutely enormous, about 500,000 employees. And I would say they're very much in their kind of A as an answer to the poll question, because they largely, were used to working as a remote workforce, and most of the Accenture people are working on various different client sites and need to kind of contact back home, but wouldn't actually go into the office. But even for them, it's hard because there's a lot of applications, a lot of services that, were considered too high value, too risky to enable access kind of outside of the of the office, essentially. And of course, if the office is literally shut, the risk of not being able to use that application kind of outweighs the risk of exposing it. So you kind of have to. And then you get into the bounds of, well, this application was probably not exposed, maybe because it's high value, but also maybe because it's mega kind of legacy as well, and doesn't comply with the same requirements and security controls as the main kind of business focused applications, maybe like email, document sharing, and things like that. They all have MFA, they all have single sign-on, but maybe these other internal applications that use for kind of admin purposes don't. So that's like a really big, difficulty when it comes to going to like full remote working. I think that most organizations have struggled with.
You have to sort of cherry pick the resources you expose and really examine your risk profile, right? With these apps. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Ranulph. Yeah, you wanted to follow up on that. Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah. Well, that was like, the old kind of way was that you could cherry pick, but now, like, you've got you have to expose to some things. You just literally have to expose. Like, you can't not. And maybe it's via VPN, but maybe everything's via VPN. And is the VPN really secure if you're allowing people access from home or other unsecured locations as well?
So as you focus, of course, on risk and control, Rob, could you talk a bit about how that has played into the notion of a distributed workforce over the last 5 years?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this has been a theme of moving more and more distributed. There's also aspects of, do you bring your own device as an end user? Many do for many companies, which, by the way, adds additional risk because the company doesn't have as tight a control over the endpoint itself. In addition, we've seen, though, this evolution, if you think about it, from partial, and it's been partial for quite some time now, of people being able to work remotely, whether they were road warriors or working from home. This has been going on for a long time. What's happened is an acceleration of that over the 5 years, and then the pandemic just kind of forced the situation where you went to 100% for most companies working remotely. And from a risk perspective, that added new things. You had functions like admin functions that were commonly done in the office behind the firewall, now being done outside the firewall, maybe through a VPN that were tunneling in. You had many organizations already on a journey to cloud. And I spoke to many IT professionals which have had that journey accelerated, where maybe they were expecting to finish in 3 years and they were told we have to get it done in a year. Or there was a move to particular SaaS applications and there was a hard push to get that done right away so people could use the SaaS applications, which, by the way, you don't usually need a VPN to get to the SaaS applications. So one quick word about that. You've also had this movement of trying to get to a perimeterless or zero trust enterprise that's been going on for some time. And most organizations are partially there. There are very few that are 100% there. So you still have these islands of perimeters with firewalls around them. And the only way to still manage those things remotely is to drill a hole through them, which we call a VPN. But I just want to emphasize, from a risk perspective, it's a hole. We like to think it's really secure, but it's a hole. It's a hole from the outside. It's an encrypted tunnel into your internal network, which is behind some type of a perimeter. And as we move to SaaS, you have fewer perimeters. As you move to cloud, the perimeters are in the cloud and they actually expect you to come from anywhere. So that we are in the midst of this paradigm shift, and all that's happened with the pandemic is just force it to move faster, force us to have to adapt, and sadly, in some cases, take shortcuts that actually opened up security problems.
Sure. Yeah. Because again, if you're trusting the device, aren't you, rather than the person when they come in via a VPN and you give them access to everything. So yeah, okay, that's an issue. So Tel, it makes me think of, that deperimeterization thing. Yeah, I think the Jericho group first, sort of articulated that. It was 20 years ago, I guess. So how much has that caught on, do you think, and what challenges do you see companies face as they move to a deperimeterized, distributed environment?
Right. So first, to relate to what Rob and Reno just mentioned, I think the scale of number of workers, number of new apps that users have to use to be productive in this remote work environment that we live in. We just think Zoom and Teams and a whole lot of new apps that IT cannot keep up with. I think this really introduces a huge challenge for companies. And of course, the fact that they needed to do this overnight, literally, and allow everybody to use those new apps and to let everybody connect to their VPN infrastructure or VDI overnight is a huge challenge. And what we've seen, lots of companies do is have all kinds of exceptions and one-offs for those users. Will allow split tunneling here, will allow those new apps over there, will allow BYOD and all kinds of terrible setups that I've seen around with enterprise that had to do something. And I think those exceptions really leave a lot of gaps in the security. And in many cases, once the exceptions has been done, no one goes back and tries to look at how do we fix them in retrospect. Specifically, one big blind spot that we see over and over again is the endpoint. Because even if you go and adopt a zero trust approach or a VPN approach, it's kind of, we think that it's safe because we've done some kind of health check for the endpoint. We do some kind of verification of the version of Windows or the Windows Defender version that they're running. But this is totally leaving a huge gap for attackers. And putting my attacker's hat on, attackers would definitely know how to leverage that. And right now, I think for many threat actors, the endpoint is a paradise. You get in through the home network, through the endpoints, and from there just jump over to the whatever sensitive asset enterprises have. So I think enterprises really need to look back into those compromises they made overnight and the blind spots and the exceptions they made, and try to think about a more holistic way to fix that.
Yeah, that's something I keep hearing, is that people had to pivot on a dime, and they and they kind of did the best they could, sending people home in taxi cabs with desktop machines and that kind of stuff. And now, they're busy trying to make their business work and stay alive, but now they've got to go back and mop up, right? It must be terrifying for a CISO. So, Ranulph, in that vein, then, I mean, what have you seen? I mean, obviously, without naming names, without talking too much about identifiable cases, what kinds of mistakes did people make, and how good are companies at going back and fixing the problem? I'm talking here about the pandemic, particularly when they had to change their way of working.
Yeah, well, I wanted to call out one particular issue on this, actually, not a specific issue, but I think something that a lot of people suffer with. A lot of our clients, especially, they're financial sector clients, and they've got pretty tight regulations on the, how you process data, and teleconferencing is part of that. The thing that happened is everyone moved over to teleconferencing platforms that were, SaaS platforms that didn't necessarily enforce some of the controls, especially about where the data was processed, what country. And therefore, they immediately moved out of compliance, essentially, and had to mop it up later. And that problem is, unfortunately, a little bit kind of still persistent, whilst those teleconferencing platforms have managed to kind of fix those issues and allow enterprises to sign up to kind of enterprise level accounts that, say, the data is not going to leave here and it's encrypted end to end, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult for them to differentiate between someone who's signing in using their enterprise account and someone who's still using their personal account. And one of the issues that, we see a lot of in terms of like the requirements that we use to test for is data exfiltration. So can a malicious user, deliberately take data out of the organization and for their own nefarious kind of benefit or whatever? And teleconferencing, like doing a conference call with yourself is actually one of the easiest ways to do that. You can share files, you can share screen, you can record, you can actually get an awful lot out of it. In that way. So, I think that the problem has largely been fixed, but there are still, in terms of like non-deliberate like use of kind of unaccredited software that isn't compliant with the regulatory reasons. But I think there's still things out there. It's a problem that still needs resolving, and I think it's kind of in the hands of the SaaS vendors to implement ways in which companies can really lock down access to their, teleconferencing, file sharing, etc. software, and stop that from happening.
Because I guess it's all running. My technical knowledge gets hazy, but I mean it's all running over port 80, right? If you're teleconferencing or some other generic sort of teleconferencing port, so you can't lock down a port because it's at the application layer. So you kind of rely on the service provider to to like integrate data loss prevention into its system, which is I don't think any.
Yeah, I mean, like you think, okay, so I can it's running over HTTPS and it's all going to like the same API endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you log in with your personal account that has literally no protections, or whether you log in with your corporate account, you're going to need to do some kind of like packet inspection, breaking the HTTPS link. So you need to understand the protocols and keep up with them that the particular SaaS vendor has implemented to make sure that that every time they click login, it's using a corporate ID. And remember, like these vendors have various different ways of logging in. So it's not just, you can't just get them to install one desktop application that has lockdowns. It's going to, you could still log in via the web, for example. So it's a moving battlefield that is probably harder to protect against than it is to find new ways to kind of get around it.
Right. So it's kind of like Swiss cheese, it opens up all these options for people to, as you said, exfiltrate data. So Rob, what's the answer there? I mean, from a controls perspective, which is where you tend to live. But how do people cope with that, with this new proliferation of options and therefore an increase in the attack surface, both for external intruders, but also for insiders as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tough problem for insiders because insiders have to run the applications, maybe web applications, to actually do their work.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I'm working in healthcare and doing claims, by definition, I have access to personal information about people. I can do my job legitimately, and the company usually there are tools you can use to be able to tell if I'm starting to go out of bounds and looking at certain things, or there's too much information for me to be seeing to be legitimate. So it's clear that I'm just, like Ranulph was saying, maybe just recording it. Many of the applications do have tools that keep you from just dumping the entire database. So that's usually not so easy for the average user. On the other hand, sysadmins often have full access. They often have access to the raw storage environment underneath everything. And you can do things there. You can encrypt that, which if it's in the cloud, often the cloud provider has easy tools to do that, which can help. You can also use techniques like microsharding, of splitting it into very small pieces of only 4 bytes each, and then putting those out into different cloud locations, so no single cloud location actually has any sensitive information. So there are things that can be done, but remember, people have jobs to do. And so by definition, they're going to have some access, and the insider threat is the toughest problem to have. I'd also just like to say the outsiders are pretty interested as well due to this pandemic situation. And so their goal is often to get some type of malicious code onto the endpoint, and then use the malicious code perhaps as a way to go elsewhere in the network, maybe because you attach to a VPN, and try to get at that data, either for ransomware or steal the data in order to sell it.
Got it. Okay, yeah. No, and the endpoint's something I want to come on to talk about next. But before we do, let's go back and look at this poll question. We've got another one coming up. But before we get to the second question, I just want to check people's answers on the first. I'm interested. Okay, so 63% of respondents said that actually they already had a distributed workforce. It went very smoothly. 18% said it was mostly new, but they transitioned well. 18% said some speed bumps. So 1 in 5 had some problems. No one did badly, and no one doesn't have a distributed workforce. So I guess that's encouraging. We also have one audience question here. It was from someone who couldn't see the poll questions. They are being answered. So whoever that was, keep fiddling around. I'm in the presenter interface, so I can't guide you through it right now. But keep looking; they are there, and we're going to give you another option now to answer a second one. So I'm just going to end this poll and bring up the next question, which is: how confident are you now in your distributed workforce security? Nice, easy set of answers here. A, completely; B, very; C, moderately confident; D, not very; and E, not confident at all. Keeps me up at night. So I'm starting that poll. Another 15 minutes. Please go ahead and try and answer those questions for us. We're going to go back to presenters now. So Rob, you mentioned the endpoint there, which is something I really wanted to get into. Obviously, that's how most of the distributed workforce interacts with its employer or contract employer. So Tal, can you talk about the biggest problems, the biggest challenges facing endpoint users from a security perspective when they're distributed around the city, the country, the world?
Of course. So there's multiple aspects to endpoints for remote workers that we should, of course, care about. I would say number one, the fact that a laptop is typically sitting at home, right? Which is an uncontrolled network with less security controls, and you would typically not just tunnel all of the traffic of the endpoint through the corporate network and then to the cloud or whatever applications you want to access. So most enterprises had to do this split tunnel kind of mode where they allow certain apps to go directly through the home network, and they lose all of the security controls they used to have in the perimeter typically. So that's one pain point, those less security controls at home. Second is the fact that you're in an environment where your family members might be using the same device, right? And you could be even using the device for personal usage because you're at home, you have to juggle different tasks, and people naturally mix personal and corporate work if they can, right? And the reality is that you can't really lock down the endpoint and say, okay, here's a corporate laptop, you can't do anything other than corporate apps, that's it. Because people need the laptop as a working environment for collaboration with third parties, like the teleconferencing apps that we just mentioned. And once you start allowing those new tools, this is a slippery slope where the bad guys can get through. Just as an example, right, Microsoft Teams, a huge vulnerability where literally someone can send you a text message in Teams and own your laptop by doing so. Microsoft obviously fixed that, but that is just an example of how those new tools that innovate really fast, and they move into this kind of SaaS cadence, even if they are desktop apps, that the security teams and IT teams cannot really cope up with this and kind of blacklist all of those apps or check them, right? So we have unsecure home networks, we have insider threat and family members. We have new apps that you must allow users to use. So these are kind of the top things that pop to mind, not to mention the fact that the bad guys leverage this situation and also leverage the pandemic itself, right, to get you to click more malicious links and open attachments related to COVID-19. So these are the kind of things that pop to mind. Last thing is another interesting example. Some attacks even try to pose as the Zoom installer, because everybody needs to be on Zoom. So they just kind of created a Zoom executable that looks like Zoom, but actually is the perfect remote access Trojan, right? And if you think about it, even the normal Zoom app or whatever teleconferencing system you're using is like the perfect tool for attackers, right? Just run this in unattended mode, and you have full control, as Renaud mentioned, over the display, the keyboard, the file system, you name it. And it's really tough for IT to protect against this kind of threat of those new apps with this conventional thinking.
Yeah, right. So actually, I want to go back to Rob on that one. So, I mean, ideally, an admin would be able to control all this stuff. They'd be able to look at some central location and stop people installing various things. But what can admins do, and what aren't they doing in a distributed setting that they should be doing?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, and we already mentioned this before, but use multi-factor authentication. So the credentials cannot just be easily stolen. That's probably the control I've seen implemented the quickest. Once companies rushed to do the pandemic, very quickly everything started needing MFA, and admins should take a look at what things a remote worker would access that wouldn't need MFA and figure out how to add it. In this day and age, it's relatively straightforward to move to MFA. Secondly, even if it's a shared machine, as Tal was just talking about, with other members of the family using it, there are things admins can do. There are tools such as trusted app listing. One of the companies I work with has this. You have a little harder to do and manage BitLocker, but things with trusted app listing, you can actually have a set of apps that are allowed, and out of the gate it can include all the most common things that family members are likely to run, and that way you're only running known good code, and secondly you're getting a report of what is being run by your user. And so there are ways to do this and require that, and you can require certain things on machines before they can connect. Another thing you can do, and Tal, I think you mentioned this with virtual desktops. Virtual desktops are another way to go. Sure, you can use your home machine, but you're actually going to create a virtual environment to actually do the work. And the admin has total control over what those virtual desktops are going to look like. And that's another method. Many applications are SaaS. There's a lot of browsing going on. There's a lot of webmail going on. Much of the danger can come from 1 minute I'm doing the applications I'm supposed to, and the next minute I'm browsing a risky website. Or I'm clicking on a link in my webmail and it goes to a risky website. And the next thing you know, I've got malware downloading onto my machine and then trying to propagate elsewhere in the enterprise. And so you can also use a technique called web isolation, kind of similar to VDI, but more specific to just web browsing, where in the back end, maybe in the cloud, you have an isolation server, and then you got the user here, and the web is further out, and they're going through that to get to the web, and all the actual browsing is done here. As long as that's a a non-porous. What I would mean by non-porous is it doesn't let some code get through, some web code get through, because a sophisticated attacker, as long as some web code gets through, they're going to figure out how to use that web code to get malware onto the machine. But if it's non-porous, such as all you get are the pixels, much like you do in VDI, you end up with a situation where even a very risky website filled with malware should not be able to end up on the user's machine. Hopefully that all makes sense, but those are things that can be implemented quite quickly, even if the machine is not owned by the enterprise. If it's owned by the enterprise, then the admins, of course, can use other types of methods as they do traditionally to manage endpoints. So I'm leaving that one aside. That's more straightforward. But we've seen so many cases in this pandemic where the people are actually encouraged to use their own machines.
Yeah, and that BYOD nightmare that CISOs
have to save money, get going quickly, and now what? But those are some ways to handle that kind of a situation. If you do own the machine, then it's easier to lock it down. You can use a BitLocker or a trusted app or something, a trusted app listing or some other technique like that. But don't just give up because you do have BYOD. There are things that can be done.
So, Ranulph, with your pen testing and your security verification of various services, do you look at the endpoint much? Can you talk about sort of endpoint vulnerabilities that you've noticed that could be a problem for distributed workers?
Yeah, we've seen some interesting things in terms of the specific issues that have come in through some of the new technologies that have been enabled for security reasons. It's one of those kind of slightly frustrating things for any security person that when you implement new security applications, they come with their own issues, and they kind of give you some, improvement of security, but also reduce it in some way as well. But I also wanted to, mention that, on the subject of VDIs, and obviously VDIs are like, the most secure option, like all the compute, everything is done on a central, desktop that sits in, the company's data center or in the cloud, or at least, a secured location. There are obviously still, attacks that you can't really get around, keyboard logging, screen grabbing, and just generally screenshots and things like that. All of which would be, imagine you've downloaded your malicious Zoom executable, you've run it, it's compromised your computer, it's logging all your keystrokes and everything that happens on your screen. Well, that's pretty much like a lot of company data is going to be captured there, even if it happens in the VDI. And the other thing is that and we've seen a lot of VDI, like companies that previously used VDIs try to get away from it a little bit because, and this is I've been looking forward to this because this is my chance to slate VDI. It's extremely expensive to run. It's extremely inefficient. You've got most people's laptops are super powerful. It's all sat there at the speed of light between your memory and your CPU. It doesn't take long. There's no latency. It's perfect. You're throwing all that in the bin and you're buying the same hardware, but it costs 10 times more because it runs on a server. And you're adding in the fact that latency is a massive problem for VDIs. When you've got say your VDIs in California, but you're sitting in London, it's going to be super slow, even if you've got a really good internet connection and really good server and a really good client. It's not going to make any difference. It's still going to be really slow. So very expensive. And also another security impact is that because they tend to be quite annoying to use, users will then kind of automatically prefer to do their work outside of their VDI and maybe try to use shadow IT, like some perfectly decent collaboration platform might be used between team members that's just not company sponsored, and it might be secure, but the problem is that the organization has no idea what data is going in there, has no idea how long it's been retained for. They can't wipe it if the person leaves. They can't disable access to that person's account if they leave the company because they have no control over that. it's a total nightmare for organizations. So, I think like, whilst VDI is the most secure solution, I really think that most organizations are looking to get away from VDI and enforce the controls on the endpoint, and even get away from VPNs as well, and allow people to access most of corporate services over the internet, just using a really good MFA setup that's universal across all applications.
Yeah, that's the beauty. That's the beauty of SaaS. I would agree, Randolph. I think we use VDI and those other techniques for your admins, and I'm not sure you want to roll it out to everybody. I do think you can use web isolation more broadly, but I'm a big believer in moving to SaaS with multi-factor authentication as much as possible. But you, as you mentioned earlier, you always have that legacy environment. There's a few legacy things that have to be done, and that's where the trouble usually lies. And then there's the work of the sysadmin, who by definition has to get to the controls that run the kingdom, so those types of people are usually more willing to accept a bit of annoyance and slowness in return for not having to go into the office.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to break in there, guys. We've got the last poll question here. I just want to stay on track with that. So let me just pull up the slides here. Quick review of the answers to this last one. Confidence in your distributed workforce security. 9% of people were completely confident. 63% were very confident, so at least some room for improvement. 27% were moderately confident. No one is not very or not at all confident. So they're either really good at their jobs or they're missing something. I'm not quite sure which, but I hope it's the former. So I'm going to end that poll and hop on back to this last one. So 15 minutes left to answer this one, audience. What aspect of distributed workforce security are you most worried about? We've got 4 here, and I've got a last one in case I missed something. Malware, ransomware is A. B is phishing, credential theft. C is access from untrusted networks. D is business email compromise. Take that as basically social engineering that isn't phishing, essentially, to steal your credentials. And then other. So I'm going to turn that on now. We've also got 15 minutes, audience. Not a single question from you guys other than I can't find the poll questions. So pull it out, get creative. Let's get at least 1 or 2 questions in if you can for the last 15 minutes. Okay, so that's live now. I want to pop back to the presenters. So I don't normally focus on sponsor technologies in these gigs, but I am interested in Isolate. So can you help me understand what it is? When I first read through the website, I just sort of thought, oh, well, can't Windows Virtual Desktop do this? Isn't this just VDI in the cloud? But I'm missing a whole bunch of stuff here. So maybe talk me through it, a little bit.
Definitely. Thanks for the question, Danny. So just to relate also to what Rob and Randolph was saying, I completely agree. And by the way, my roots are at VMware, so I've seen close up the challenges of VDI and DAS. You know, the user experience challenges, the cost challenges, the security challenges of screenshots and key logging. So these are all true, and I completely agree. And this is part of the reasons we built Isolate. Just to explain the difference between Isolate and VDI, right? With Isolate, you're not really running a virtual desktop in the cloud or in the data center. Actually, you're using your expensive laptop, as you mentioned, guys, to run a local virtual machine, which is optimized for this use case of work. So you can have like one zone, which is your original OS on your laptop, used for, let's say, personal stuff, and another one for the sensitive corporate access on the local device itself. And because it's on the local device, we evade those problems of, number one, user experience, because you're using your bare metal, the expensive laptops that you have bought. And second, you don't have any infrastructure cost challenges like storage and compute and so on, because it's all local and distributed, right? So the user experience is better. It's local, so it doesn't cost a fortune to keep up with the number of users and in the data center. And third, even in terms of security, because we have some kind of software running on the endpoint itself, we can actually protect against screenshots and keylogging and other things. We're, by the way, using Hyper-V, which is baked into Windows 10 on every laptop. So we can actually give you the best of all worlds. You get this great holy grail kind of isolation of a virtual machine with a local experience and much dramatically less cost, right? And by the way, I also relate to what Rob, you said about app whitelisting and code signing. I think this is a great practice. The challenge I think we see enterprises facing when they try to adopt this is, if the endpoint is a monolithic thing, right? You have just one OS, then turning on app whitelisting and just limiting what apps the users can do and run would limit what they can practically do for their jobs, right? And it's a lose-lose situation with users. If you lock down too much, they obviously can't do their work. If you let go, you open up gaps. But once you break this monolithic endpoint into two zones, like we offer, you can actually turn on app whitelisting to the extreme in the corporate zone, while giving users full freedom on the other side, which is like the win-win that we all want to get to. And just last other comment on the discussion here, I think also versus web isolation, technology that I really like, it's great, but for specific use cases where you just need web access, I think what we see today is more and more apps, like of course Office, but many other desktop apps that need more than just the web. You think about video conferencing apps, you can't really just use the web version of them because they need camera and they need a lot of stuff that work. It depends on the use case. And final comment, we also see that the kind of, let's just use SaaS on a laptop with 2FA and maybe an MDM kind of solution to enroll the user's machine into MDM. From the attacker's perspective, I think going down that path of just, access this from any laptop as long as you got host health check working and 2FA, that's fine. I think that is a bit too risky for enterprises. I think it's not enough just to enroll your machine in MDM. It would say that you have an antivirus installed and you have 2FA, because attackers will just wait for the moment where you authenticated, and they will write your session to the crown jewels and do whatever harm they want to do on your production. So just my 2 cents on that.
I'm not even going to ask any questions, Rob, but over to you. You can go ahead and talk.
No, I think there's some great points, and nothing. By the way, nothing is foolproof. I can tell you, just using passwords and not using MFA is a mistake. So you need to do more. However, you did an interesting poll question, and not to lead the audience, I personally consider malware the biggest problem, because when malware gets onto your machine, it's game over. And Tal just took us through a whole bunch of scenarios. The scenarios are actually endless. Once your machine is compromised, you're in big trouble. And so organizations really have to look at ways to keep malware from getting onto machines. It's easier if the company actually owns the system. They can lock it down more. That was very interesting about Isolate. I like the 2 zones. You can lock it down more. You still have to worry if the machine itself does become compromised, especially if it's at a very low level like the BIOS. Even additional technology can have problems in both areas. Nothing is foolproof. And so you've got to have defense in depth. There isn't going to be one silver bullet. In fact, you've heard that from us. Multiple techniques. You might do more when it's more sensitive. Admins are obvious things that are more sensitive. People accessing sensitive data, people doing high-value transactions, by definition, need additional security. And the MFA in those cases is probably going to be a little tougher. It's probably going to involve some type of external device, maybe not even just your phone. It might be a little bit tougher. So you just have to kind of go down this risk path and decide, how much additional pain am I going to cause those users in terms of performance and ease of use in order to have better security, versus perhaps my normal application users, the vast majority of my population, that might not need to go to extremes, but still need additional security than just running their family computer to do the SaaS applications.
The person who put other in the in this poll question, most people have selected ransomware, Rob, as you mentioned. I'm dying to know what that other is. There's one person, so just why don't you throw it over in a comment in the audience question so we can see what that was. But Ranulph, what do you think about this idea of defense in depth and one program, one measure not being enough to protect against these various threats.
I couldn't agree more. And it's not even defense in depth. People think of defense in depth normally as like, I've got one control that works and then several other controls down below that kind of also work. So, it's layers of security you have to get through. But often the reality is that it's actually a puzzle in which they all have to work before any of the security to work. Think about EDR as an example. It doesn't do anything really unless you also enforce least privilege as well. Essentially, if you've got a user who can become an administrator on a computer and therefore system, therefore, an attacker can do the same thing and remove all EDR software, like if they know where to look, bypass the whole thing, and maybe even create fake log entries to make it look like the EDR software is still working. It's trivially easy. The whole thing only really works if you have someone, the ability to stop people from being an administrator, so they can't remove the software, they can't identify the executable, stop it from running, and things like that. Which is obviously really difficult when you've got bring your own devices, because if you tell a user that they can't be admin on their own device and they can't install any software on their own device, they're not going to be happy about it, and it might even go as far as deterring them from wanting to work for your company, which is a big deal. In fact, Accenture just did a recent survey where one of the main highlights of it was that people have to kind of embrace remote working, because otherwise you're not going to find the workforce. All the really highly skilled people have been remote working for 12 months now. They've realized they can do it and they didn't want to go back to the office. So if we will rush back to the office, it's probably going to prevent you from hiring. Not going to link it back with the security, but it'll probably prevent you from hiring a lot of good security personnel, which is obviously is going to be the key thing to securing your organization. In the pen testing industry, we've really seen it. Like almost every candidate I screen or I interview is remote only. They don't want to work from the office at all.
Okay, got it. I hope people can hear me. You're breaking up there, and I think it's my network. Tal, we've got like a minute and a half left. Other than use our product, which I know would be one piece of advice you'd want to give, what are the 3 bullet points? What should people do to secure their endpoints in a distributed workforce? And after that, we may just end up dropping out because we're running low on time. But go ahead. Sure.
So I think number one, people really need to think of the users as part of the security story, as you guys mentioned. So it's not enough just to go with full security and just turn on all the security products and all the restrictions we can. You have to be keeping the user in mind. As people mentioned here, they will find workarounds. So I believe you need to do something that would split the monolith into 2 zones. It doesn't have to be Isolate, by the way. It could be a virtual desktop or a web isolation and a local machine. We obviously think Isolate gives you the best of all worlds, but I think just breaking this monolith of an endpoint into separate zones is the right way to go into the future of remote work. It's also on the other side, on the cloud and network security, zero trust approaches. I truly believe that's the right path for the future. But again, in that kind of story, you have to keep in mind that if you just implement zero trust and you let people access from any random laptop, it's not enough. You have to tie this story back into the endpoint. So if you don't trust your endpoints and you're saying, I'm doing zero trust, you're practically doing security theater. So try to keep that in mind and find a way to regain trust in the endpoint while you're implementing that, to do some real deep security end-to-end. I hope making sense.
No, that's great. Really appreciate those insights and insights from all of you. I think it's just one of the best webinars I've done in a long time. Really enjoyed it. So thanks again, everyone. I think we're running low on time. We've got like 45 seconds left. So I just want to thank everyone for participating, Isolate for sponsoring. I hope to have you guys all back again at various points and hear your insights on other topics. Naughty audience, didn't get one audience question from you. Hopefully that means I've done my job really well and asked all the right questions, but hopefully we get more next time around. And it's been great. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks again.
Thanks
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.